Principal Matters Podcast, episode 470. Hi, friends. This is Will Parker, host of Principal Matters, the school leaders podcast, where each week we bring you inspiring, innovative, and imaginative ideas for your own school leadership. And this week, I'm bringing back a special guest, Tim Villegas, to talk about staying committed to inclusivity. Tim Villegas is Director of Communication for Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education and the founder of Think Inclusive, which is the blog, podcast, and social media handle for MCIE. He has 16 years experience in public education as a teacher and district support specialist, and he focuses now on how media and communications can promote inclusive education for all learners. You can go back and hear the first time he was on our show at episode 406, but welcome back, Tim. Why don't you fill in the gaps on that intro and tell listeners something they may be surprised since the last time they met you?
Oh, thanks for having me back, Will. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and there's so much to talk about with regards to inclusion and inclusivity. So, filling in the gaps, I'm not exactly sure, what would be relevant. I will say that it's this in August of 2025. I'll be starting my 6th year with MCIE, which is wild to think about because I never really thought I'd be in a communications role, and so I'm very fortunate to be doing what I'm doing and have a great job and get to talk to fantastic people like you and then and host my own podcast. So it's amazing.
Well, congratulations, and we'll point people to your podcast and all your resources at the end of today's show. You're coming to me from Atlanta today, and I'm sitting in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're going to be recording this close to the end of a school year, but sharing it at the beginning of a new school year. So this will come out sometime in October. And I have a feeling by the time this comes live, there will be even more things to talk about than we have right now. But I wanted to bring you back to the show because there's this crazy moment that we're living in now where even the word inclusivity is being questioned. Words like equity and inclusion and diversity. And sometimes when I see the guidance that's come out, and I'm just going to pick specifically on the federal government, about ways that we can and cannot instruct students, I read it and it's nonsensical, Tim, because I can't think of a school that actually can thrive and survive without being diverse and equitable and inclusive. So let's come back to the real meaning of those words and why they still matter. And this is why I brought you on the show. But I wanted to actually ask you to take us back because you posted about this a few weeks back. And I thought, man, this was such a thoughtful post. And you began with a story about a college professor who challenged you on inclusivity. Do you mind talking about that as one of your first experiences?
Absolutely. So I'm originally from California, and so when I got my first teaching job as a special education teacher for students on the autism spectrum, the my very first class that I taught, I was still a provisional educator. So I was still going to school to quote unquote clear my credential. And part of my teacher education was I took a behavior support class, and that professor is would I would characterize as a diehard inclusionist, what I would call myself now. And her charge to the students in her class was to create an inclusion plan for a student, especially those students that are in self-contained or segregated environments, like the students that I was teaching. And so I remember telling her, I'm like, this is not going to work. Like, I don't know. I don't know. Have you met my students? Do you understand? Do you understand the needs that they have? They need structure. They need routine. They need a highly specialized curriculum and all this stuff that, I thought that they needed at the time. And she just very graciously said, you know, just follow the process and do the assignment, and then let's see what happens. And so the basics of the assignment was that I was to pick a student and try to pick a student that has a high support needs that you would not normally think would be included meaningfully in a general education classroom, collaborate with that teacher and create a plan for that student to be included. And so I collaborated with a fifth grade teacher, and it was around a social studies lesson of topography maps. And this particular student loved to cut and tear bits of paper, and this was just something that he really enjoyed doing. And so the plan was to have him join the activity of creating the topography maps by actually cutting out cardboard that the students would place on top of each other to create these 3D maps. And so when we, walked down the hall and entered into the classroom, this is a student, Will, that had some significant behavior challenges. Um, could be extremely overloaded, just with sensory overload, overstimulation. Um, we just had to be very careful about where we were with this particular student. And he also is a non-speaking, had very few ways to communicate what he actually wanted. And I was ready for it to be a disaster. But because we planned in advance, because we used his strengths, because we used his interests, it went so much better than I ever thought it would. He sat with his classmates. He contributed. He participated in the activity, and the light bulb went on for me, and I realized, oh, you just have to plan. You just have to have some thought about what is the student going to be doing? Is it aligned with their strengths? Um, is it meaningful? Does it actually make sense? Like if I was in the back of the room having him color a worksheet, would that have been meaningful? No, that's not something that he would have wanted to do. But because we had a process, because we planned, it was successful. And
I love it.
that changed me. That experience changed me. And I just wanted more of that. I'm like, well, if we can do it with him, we can do this with any of my students. And so that really changed my trajectory with with inclusion.
I love that story so much because everyone who's listening to this who's been a teacher can relate to that. I had an assumption about my kids, students, fill in the blank, depending on their characteristics, their needs, their high needs, their testing, whatever, fill in the gaps. Um, and the wisdom in that professor was, well, let's follow the process and see what happens. And instead of putting you in a box, that professor gave you the chance to also experiment to see. And it could have been a disaster in some other way too. But the beauty of that situation, Tim, is that it gave you a light bulb moment and a new lens through which to look at your students moving forward. So stay there for a minute and please be the teacher of teachers, if you don't mind, and especially the listeners to this podcast who are leaders of learning. Um, what lessons would you want to have school leaders keep in mind when they're trying to build communities that where inclusivity still matters?
I think one of the big lessons is that learners deserve, especially learners with high support needs, deserve to be included in classrooms and experiencing the curriculum just like everyone else. They are general education students first and foremost. And so when you have the mindset that they belong, then you're gonna do everything you can to make it work and give them give them access, right? Um, and I'm not sure if we've talked about this before, but it's a very common metaphor of like access ramps to buildings and curriculum, right? If you have a disabled person using a wheelchair and all there is stairs into a building, there is no access to that building. But if you have a ramp and you design the building with access in mind for anyone, they can use the ramp and get into the building. Well, as we create, as we're building our curriculum, as we're building how we are, how our instruction, our interventions, if we design with every sort of learner in mind, and maybe a particular learner, like this, the one in the example that I gave, we designed a lesson uh, in order for him to access that lesson. Now he accessed it at a very um, at an entry point, right? At an entry level point. Um, like we did not ask him to analyze the topography maps, but we did ask him to participate. And not to say that he couldn't, but that was an entry point. And so, how can we design our classrooms and access to curriculum, and keep that in mind and believe that students belong in our schools and our classrooms? I think that is one of the biggest lessons.
Okay, so let's sit there because I have a follow-up question for that, which is that if we believe that all students belong, and let's make the assumption that all students have a place in general education settings, if we learn to build the access ramps for their learning into those opportunities, Tim, like let's follow up on that question because I want you to help paint this picture. I've heard so many leaders talk about the initiative Portrait for a Graduate, where they'll try to create in advance the ideal outcome that they want to see for a student when they walked across that stage. And so, if you are working with a teacher or a leader who's trying to create a portrait for a graduate where all students belong and all students have access to the most meaningful kind of learning, what kind of vision would you want leaders and educators to keep in mind for even the students with the highest support needs?
I think historically we've had this idea that if a student has a high support needs, if we individualize and we um, we place them in classrooms where there's a low student to teacher ratio and they have highly specialized curriculum, typically life skills, um, that provides better outcomes for that student. But the unfortunate reality is that the longer a student is separated or segregated from the general population of students, of their peers, the more likely they will be segregated later in life. And so there's this fable that I'll have to send it to you, Will. There's this fable that a friend of mine, he has since passed. He's one of the co-founders of TASH, an organization, disability rights and an inclusion organization. A former educator. He used to tell this fable of two students, of twin sisters, and one was included and one was, not included. And the point of the story is that you could have it's not the student that is the determination of the outcome. It is the system that the student is brought up and educated in. And so the more a student is separate and segregated from their peers, from their same age peers, the more likely it is that when they graduate, they have not had the time, exposure, the relationships, the friendships to enter into this world that is not segregated. Like you go to different public places and there isn't, the This is for disabled people over here, and this is for everyone else. But that is, schools are one of the very few places that that happens. You have a disability, you have high support needs. Oh, we have a very special program here for you, you know. And so when a student is included and has access and is exposed to their same age peers and has the potential for relationships and friendships, by the time they graduate, by the time they they exit the public school system, they have all of those things in that experience. So it is much easier for them to be in society, in community. Um, the kind of the exceptions would be, well, that's not really an exception, but if you have a student who has been historically segregated and then they graduate, they will often go to a like a separate day program, or maybe I mean, I've even seen adults with disabilities live in nursing homes because there's nowhere else for them to go, you know.
Mhm.
And that doesn't, that's not the kind of life that you want, I would think, for a young person who is graduating. And so where are they going to live? What are they going to be doing? I think inclusion it gives the best outcome. And so that's what I would love for leaders to think about. It's like when you're thinking about students in kindergarten and they have high support needs, and you fast forward to, you know, when they're 18, 19, 20, depending on, how long they stay, what is their life going to look like? And what is their
Mhm.
life going to look like afterwards?
So the fallacy that you're confronting is, even though a lot of this has been done with the best intentions, the idea that separating students with high support needs from their peers and only giving them individualized direct instruction compared to high support students being placed in the same classrooms with general education students and bridging that gap of learning that needs to happen gives them the setup for the vision that you want for them as future adults. And so I know that anyone listening to this right now is already trying to put students in categories. Well, what about students with the highest needs? Or what about students in this needs? Or what about students on this side of the spectrum or that? And that's not the point of what you're trying to say. What you're trying to say is let's begin first with the most optimistic vision for what we want and let's build from there. And it's one of the reasons I reached out to you, because there are some, especially now in the some of the movement within our federal government guidance, the current US Secretary of Health and Human Services are often saying things in public based on fallacy or false assumption. And so I wanted to just give you a platform with my audience to talk a little bit about why, especially let's use students with autism as an example, why it's so dangerous for us to have the wrong understanding of the science and the practice around students with autism when it comes to a mindset for inclusivity.
Um, well, where do we start here? I think wh- when I heard the secretary characterize learners on the autism spectrum as giving them things that they would never do, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
it really set me off, Will, is what happened. And it's not just me, that there was a lot of people, a lot of reaction to his comments. And he tried to walk back some of those comments, and say, well, I wasn't really talking about, the kids with low support needs. I was talking about, the quote unquote really disabled ones, which I was like that I was like, well, that doesn't really make it better, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
um
yeah. So for context, let me just say this too, because I
yeah.
know I shared this quote with you. You included a quote from Eric Garcia, who was a guest on my show too, by the way. I read his book, We Are Not Broken, a prominent journalist, also who has grown up with his own diagnosis of autism. But he said, or he wrote, of course, there are autistic people, including non speaking autistic people and ones with intellectual disabilities who require significant support. Even so, they don't deserve Kennedy's awful rhetoric that describes them not as people, but as burdens. And so I know you responded to that in your piece, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about why that is, for lack of a better word, motivating people by fear instead of motivating them by optimism.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that that's a really good way to characterize it. Um, I find the rhetoric of Secretary Kennedy to be um, to be definitely fear based, and it frankly it parallels the same sorts of things that are said about why we shouldn't include certain people in general education or in school in general. Like these people are so disabled, they will never do this, they will never play baseball, they will never hold a job, they will never write a poem. All these things. And first of all, there's this it creates this kind of this like panic um, and around autism is stealing our children, right? Um, this this kind of sentiment around that there's an epidemic going on and there's something must be done, um, which I think is a false. I think that is false. I think that's a false narrative about autism. We can talk about that a little bit more too, but when you characterize certain people that way, then it's easier for them to say, well, they need something extra special, they need they need more intervention, they need more specialized help, and it's easier for that, for us to set up special schools for autism, special classes for autism. And you know what, Will? We're talking about this right now, but I see, I'm projecting that we will see more schools that are dedicated to educating learners on the autism spectrum, and I think that's a mistake. I really do. For the very reason we talked about, right? These two paths. The more you segregate somebody, the less likely it is for them to reintegrate into a community that is accepting. It's the whole concept of generalization, right? Um, this idea is taught in like teacher education programs, especially around special education. It's like if you're trying to teach someone to do a task, you know, like follow a routine, you want to teach that routine in the place where they're going to practice that routine. You don't want to do it in an artificial environment because then that's harder to generalize. So, I mean, that's a very basic concept, but if you are teaching a highly specialized curriculum in specialized classes with, specialized personnel, and then you expect that learner to now live in life where none of that is available, what do you think is going to happen? And so, and it's just it doesn't mimic the way that we learn. We learn best when we learn in natural environments. And so, unfortunately, I think that is we're going to see more of that specialized charter schools, specialized special schools where it's only, learners with autism, maybe a particular quote unquote severity. I just think that's the wrong approach, but that is what is coming, I believe, and that is, where I believe the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education is going.
So let me just pause and speak directly to, thank you for that. And let me speak directly to my listeners because I guarantee we've got people listening to this conversation right now that are experiencing inclusivity or not, depending on where they are, in rural settings, suburban settings, urban settings, private, charter, public. I mean, so we have schools across all those varieties that listen to the show. And what I don't want listeners to hear us saying is that depending on the place and the geography and the history and the budgets and the resources that you have, that that if the ideal isn't present where you are, then you need to panic or fear or any of those things either.
Hmm.
But what I always appreciate when I talk to you, Tim, is such a refreshing reminder. And this is the reason you do this work. This is the whole reason that Maryland Coalition for Inclusive Education exists, is to invite educators into what is the research shows the best practice and the best outcomes possible for students and the best ways we can do this. And so even if our practices are now being questioned, or maybe we realize we don't have any of these practices, there's always a place to begin. And
Hmm.
so, and I know people are across that spectrum of awareness. So, if I'm going to invite listeners to go back to the episode we did on 406, if they want to hear you talk about some of those more, let me invite you into this new mindset. In this episode, I really wanted you to be able to revisit with us as a way to speak to educators who may need encouragement and advice of how to keep moving forward in light of all this misinformation that's now become so prominent. And so, do you mind speaking to that?
Absolutely. Yes. I think there's a lot of desperation everywhere. We, me and Carolyn Teagland, our CEO, spoke with a parent yesterday afternoon, and she is advocating for her child to be included, and the district continues to say that he requires life skills classes and needs to have a different, highly specialized curriculum. Um, and and so she was asking for some advice. And what I tell her and what I try to tell everyone is that you're not always going to be able to change um, your district. Um, the districts that we work with willingly want to participate in systems change. They have recognized that it is a need that they want to work on, and they have developed a partnership and a relationship with us, and we are um, working with them on that. Um, that doesn't always happen, and so where can you focus your attention on to move inclusive education or inclusive practices forward in your own context? And so what I would say is when I worked for a school district and I was trying to make change, I focused on what was in my control, which was my own classroom, developing relationships with general education teachers in my school building, and moving forward with trying to change mindsets in my very, very small, circle of influence. And we saw some progress. It's not the progress that I wanted. And just like for this parent or any other educator or leader out there, sometimes you're not going to make the progress that you want. But does that mean that the progress that you did make, the impact that you did make, uh, doesn't matter? And I would argue that it matters a whole lot to the people that it has impacted. It matters to the educators that you have a relationship with. It matters to the students that you've impacted, and it matters to you. I think, I am a different person because I've advocated for inclusive practices. And so all of that is impact. It's smaller than we want, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't matter.
Hmm. I'm glad you said that because, and I know we're preaching to the choir when we talk to educators who care so deeply about their schools and students. but that's the most effective remedy that I'm seeing during all of this time, Tim, when people are just battling all kinds of conflicting guidance and all kinds of misinformation, is they still show up every day and they're like, okay, with my students in this school, in this setting, and my families, what can I do in the setting that I have? And I love how you said to control what I can control and to make the most impact that I can with what I have right in front of me for the benefit of my students and my community and my parents. I want to give you an opportunity as we wrap up, to just also invite people to collaborate with the work that you guys are doing, because you don't just work in Maryland. You guys affect practices all over the U.S. So talk to the listeners for a little bit about some of the ways that the resources at MCIE or connecting with you there might be helpful for them as they're working through how to lead towards the most optimistic and ideal outcome for inclusivity in their schools.
Absolutely. If what we are been talking about today is of any interest to you, we love to talk to you. We like to say our work begins with a conversation, and that is exactly what happens. Usually, partners that are outside of Maryland, our work begins with a 30-minute call to say, here is the vision that we have for our district. We want to be more inclusive. We want to learn how to adapt and modify lessons for learners with high support needs. We want to get better at co-teaching and co-planning. We want to get better at casting an inclusive vision and helping change mindsets in our district. All those things are entry points and ways to engage in this work. And so we are happy to have a conversation with anyone, anywhere about that work. And if we're not able to do that work with you, then we can maybe even point to another organization that can. So while we'd love to work with as many districts as possible, I tell our CEO a lot, I'm like, even if we doubled our work from what we do now, it's just barely a drop in the bucket to what is needed in the United States in our public school system. So we are happy to have a conversation about that. As far as resources go, we have a lot of different resources at our website at mcie.org. We have a resources tab that has a number of different tools that we utilize with our partners. And then we also have one of our major resources is our podcast, Think Inclusive, where we feature conversations with people doing the work of inclusion in the real world. So whether it's a principal or whether it's a family who has gotten some traction in their district, or it's just thought leaders in the field, there's lots of different nuggets that you can pull from to inspire and encourage your own journey with all of this. So happy to discuss that with anyone, mcie.org, and we'd love to talk to you.
Well, Tim, thank you. And as we wrap up, I'm actually going to just circle back to what we began with, and I'll put a link in the notes to the post that you made for your followers and listeners that led me back into this conversation too. But when your professor challenged you to think about the student in your care, and this is, I'm going to just quote you from your own piece where you said that your professor told you, pick the student you think could never be included and create a plan. And that began you down this pathway now that you've been on for forever. And so I just want to say to listeners today, as a challenge, I want you to think about that today as you go into school or to work or however you're serving. Think about someone who you believe could never that you would think that, oh, this one would be the one that could never be included in that kind of inclusivity and that kind of engagement. And then I challenge you to create a plan toward that end and just see what happens. Because I think Tim, I think what people will be surprised to discover is the same capacities that exist when we build, as you said, those access of ramps to learning that happen in the minds and the experience of students that sometimes we just don't know until we've entered into that journey with them. And then, my goodness, when the light bulb goes off for us, imagine what that's going to be like for the students that we're serving. So Tim, thank you so much for the opportunity to listen and to learn with you. And listeners, we will put links to the contacts for Tim in the show notes. But until next time, thank you for doing what matters, my friend. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Will.